Ladies and gentlemen, angry Americans around the country and around the world, I am very, very happy and humbled to be joined by a guest I've really been excited about having on this show for some time now. I think my favorite general on TV and one of my favorite military strategic leaders in the country and a true patriot, someone that I think is a voice to be heard, especially in times like this. General, the great and powerful General Mark Hertling is with us today. How are you, sir?
Hey, I'm doing great, Paul. And boy, what a lead in. I wish my mother was alive to hear that. She'd be proud of me.
Well, I'm sure wherever she is, she's proud of you because you're doing some good stuff, and you've been a great friend to me and a great voice of reason for our country. And I'm really just grateful to have you. You're also, I think, the most senior ranking officer we've ever had on the show.
Wow.
So as a lowly first lieutenant, I am grateful to have a 3-star joining us here on Angry Americans.
Well, I got to be honest with you, Paul. It's good to be on with you because I've seen the kinds of things you've done for Afghan and Iraqi vets, and the way you started your career and made a name for so many people that needed support. So I'm happy to be here with you, and I appreciate you asking me on.
Excellent, excellent. So the first question I usually ask folks, we're in the pandemic, everybody's experiencing it differently. You know, you're a combat leader, you've been all around the world, you inspire others, but can you break down on a very basic level, sir, where are you and how are you?
My wife and I retired here in Florida. We're in Orlando. Was offered a job by a healthcare organization, which surprised a lot of people. I didn't want to get into the defense industry. I wanted to do something very different. And for the last 6 years since I retired, I've been working primarily in healthcare, working a thing called a Global Partnering Initiative, trying to bring healthcare to different locations around the world and also bring good ideas back to the United States. But in the last couple of years, Paul, they've asked me to put together something called a physician leader course because they wanted to use some of the things they saw in me in terms of leadership to help their doctors become better leaders in the organizations and have them collaborate more. So that's now become my passion. It's been a lot of fun. And over the last couple of years, we've trained about 600 or 700 doctors to be better leaders. And what's great is now in this pandemic, in this crisis, I'm not only able to see them execute in their roles, their new leadership roles, but also to see how they've taken some of the military lessons and apply them in a crisis in healthcare. And it's been really a revelation to watch these young men and women do some things in an industry that's really fraught with a lot of dysfunction and inefficiencies.
I'm really looking forward to having a discussion with you about the national security landscape and, you know, increasingly how in many ways I think we're vulnerable here at home because of our response to the pandemic. I want to go deeper on your assessment of the battlefield and even in Florida. But before we get to that, we're all dealing with the pandemic differently. We're getting to know our guests. And I want to ask you a question I ask of all our guests. What is your, as we'd say in the military, adult beverage of choice? What is your drink of choice when you're in Florida and taking a break?
Well, it depends on the situation. DOTS, an acronym I use a lot. It depends on the situation. If it's during the cooler months, it's usually an old fashioned. During the summer months, the happy hour drink is a gin and tonic. During an afternoon on Saturday, spent a lot of time in Germany, so I'm a big Hefeweizen fan of the beer genre. And if I'm in a formal event and usually have to go with wine, it's a red Cabernet or some kind of red blend. So is that good enough for you?
That's excellent. I love DOTS. I think that's going to be a mantra for this discussion and probably for the next couple of years in America, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Normally we would be in person, so I can't toast you. I think I'm having a coffee, you're having a coffee. So,
Yep.
Cheers to that. Did you learn any German toasts in all your time in Germany, sir?
Well, I can actually order beer in 39 different languages, but I can only ask where the bathroom is in about 14 of those. So you have to kind of measure your response. But yeah, I mean, Slange, obviously the Irish click, Prost, Zoom full. There's all sorts of things. It's just good to be drinking.
I knew you were going to be full of surprises, sir. So
Yeah,
that ability to order, being a general, I think in part is like being a diplomat, right? Especially
it is.
in all the different stations you've been around the world. But you're very dedicated to your hometown town of St. Louis. I know you're a big sports fan there. The other question we ask of all our guests to get to know you a little bit, General Mark Hertling, what was your very first car?
Oh, well, I thought you were going to go somewhere else with that, Paul. I thought you were going to talk about beer in St. Louis, and that's always a sore subject because after spending time in Germany, there's no way I'm going back to Bud or Bud Light, and I'm apologizing for that right off the top of my head. But that's something I drank in my growing up years, either legally or illegally. My very first car that I purchased coming out of the military academy was a 1974 MGB.
Wow. Wow.
Yep.
What color was it? What color was it,
Yeah,
sir?
I don't know if I can do this on the show, but my wife used to call it baby shit yellow. Is that a bad way to describe it? It was that yellowish sort of color of the early MGB series that traded off the hard chrome bumper for the rubber bumpers. It was a great convertible though. It's great. When I took it to Germany as a second lieutenant, you would drive it all week and fix it all weekend because the electrical system was so bad on the British Leylands.
I think that's a very accurate description. So I appreciate the military precision with which you describe the color of that vehicle. You're a pretty tall guy. How did you fit in an MGB?
A lot of people ask me that, but I had a small steering wheel, a custom steering wheel that they put on it for me. And when you're in that thing, you're lying down. So my length is in my leg. So you were just flat out and the seat was all the way back. It was great. I'm 6'4". My wife is 4'11". So whenever we traveled any place, she's actually 5 foot. We'd always pack all the stuff in her side on her foot. It wouldn't bother her at all while I'd be stretched out in the car. But it was a great car, Paul. I loved it. We kept it for about 6 years. Traded it in when we had our first son, obviously. I tried to convince her to put, the baby seat on the luggage rack, but she wouldn't buy into that,
Excellent. I'd love to see a picture of you and your wife in Germany with you over 6 feet, with her at 5 feet, the convertible, the baby shit yellow car. I mean, that's kind of that's living a great life when you're a young lieutenant being stationed in Germany. There's a lot I want to talk about in the national security space. I want to come back to Germany in a second, but I want to get your assessment. You've been all around the world. You've been a combat leader. You're a strategic expert, but you're also an expert on America. You're translating on CNN and to other audiences on a regular basis. Can you give us your assessment of the battlefield, if you will, against the virus in Florida, where you are? That's like our Fallujah right now, right? You and I are in the Middle East at the same time. What's your assessment of the battle space in Florida and in America as a military leader with your experience?
Well, what I think we've unfortunately done, Paul, is we've replaced our social contract, our efforts to contribute to the society with this individual feeling of freedom. And this requirement to have freedom and America and all this other stuff and individual freedom as opposed to a social contract which contributes to everyone. In working with the healthcare organization I'm with, we started seeing some clusters of this in February. It started to ramp up in March, and we were scared to death. I mean, there was some high anxiety within the healthcare with our trend lines and our modeling in where it would go and where it would take our hospital. Now, Orlando hasn't been hit as hard as the southern cities within Florida, but the state as a whole has not done well. The healthcare organizations have struggled across the state, and it's primarily because they've been overwhelmed. We have been able to get the supplies, to work the logistics, to build teams of different doctors and be ready for it. But there's been this tidal wave on a couple of occasions of patients. And I think anyone who says, hey, I don't have to wear a mask, I don't have to social distance, I wish I could take all of those people for 10 minutes into one of our emergency rooms or into one of our ICUs and let them see what is going on, because it is bad. Now, it's not as bad, again, I say this, it's not as bad in our system than it is in some of our sister organizations, but we just posted the highest death rate yesterday, from what I understand, and I'm watching the trend lines every day. It's not good.
Mm.
And we haven't started school yet. That's going to be another problem area, I think. And anyone who says it's not going to be just doesn't understand the science of disease. Paul, I made the big mistake early on in this of rereading a book I read about 6 years ago called The Great Influenza.
Mm.
And if you haven't read that about the 1918, not the 1917 pandemic, but the 1918 pandemic, it scares the bejesus out of you because we're experiencing exactly the same kind of things today. And yet we're not taking the precautions to try and end it as best we should as a nation.
Sir, you know, I've made the case that this is a national security imperative. And I don't think that most Americans are thinking about it that way. I want to talk about Russia with you, of course. I want to talk about other national security threats. But in many ways, our back door is wide open, right? Our medical systems are overwhelmed. Our people are demoralized. Our military is occupied. And this is, in many ways, a dream for our enemies. So I've often used the hashtag, you know, our enemies are celebrating. And in the context of a great fight, it requires sacrifice. So when I hear that, you know, we have to give up college football, yeah, that sucks. But if it means our national security, it's necessary, right? If we've got to do these things in support of our national security, I believe it's necessary. But can you frame this up in the context of our overall national security? In your view, how vulnerable are we, and where should we prioritize the pandemic versus Russia, North Korea, other threats?
I'm very surprised that we haven't been taken advantage of as much as some could as of yet. I put it in the context, Paul, of the elements of power. You know, when you talk about national security and the elements of power, the first things that come to your mind, the so-called DIME model, the diplomacy, information, military, and economics. Okay, get away from that and think about more elements of power. Your reputation on the world stage, your observation as being a nation that can actually get things accomplished, your other nations looking at you and viewing you as a society where people come together and solve problems and collaborate. In every one of those areas that are elements of national security, the way we are seen on the world stage, it's deteriorated over the last 6 months. We're seen as the class clowns right now. We are not doing well with the pandemic, and every nation in the world is watching us, and they can't believe their eyes because we're the nation that put a man on the moon, and yet we're the worst in terms of dealing with a health issue. And then you add to that the advertisement of where we stand on PPE, the early stages of PPE, how we're misjudging the scientists and countering their actions with opinions. It's amazing from my standpoint, having lived around the world. I know because I've talked to former colleagues in other countries, and they're asking me, what the hell is going on in your country? So yeah, that's just the reputational piece of it. Then when you talk about the ability of the military to react, the ability of the diplomatic corps to do the things they need to do when a great number of our embassies are not staffed with ambassadors, when our State Department is bleeding talent, when our military is being used in some ways that don't seem to be in line with our constitutional norms, all of those things should scare the heck out of us because they are also being reflected on the world stage, and it's not a good look in the mirror of the United States.
Sir, one issue that I know you want to talk about, and I've been covering that I don't think has gotten nearly enough national attention, is the withdrawal of our troops in Germany. Thousands of troops that have been pulled out under Trump's direction, supported by now the Secretary of Defense. In my view, it's a gift to Putin. I think we continue to do things that play to the advantage of Putin and others and other enemies who would like to see our forces shift in the way they are. But can you break down that move particularly? What's happening in Europe, what's happening in Germany, and for people who don't track on military affairs on a regular basis, in the larger context, how does that change to our posture, affect our overall strength and security? And does it play into the hands of Putin and our enemies?
Yeah, I really actually believe it does play right into Putin's hands, but it also further divides an alliance that we spent 70 years building and has some incredible strengths to it. And it was an action, in my view. I'll state my opinion on this from a military perspective. Paul, I spent 8 of my last 10 years in the service in Europe in various roles. The final role is the commander of U.S. forces in Europe. And during that time, we structured the force organization with a great deal of work and brain power and coordination to meet the requirements of a force that is overseas to meet myriad contingencies, build alliances, and contribute to our security. So I guess the first thing I should have done for any of your listeners who think that US forces are in Europe to defend Germany against Russia, that ended about 30 years ago. We are no longer on a defensive position to defend Europe or to defend Germany or any other country. We're part of a security alliance. Number two, for any of your listeners who are saying, well, they're not paying their own way. Well, that's not quite true either. They don't pay to a bank account. They promise to pay a certain amount of their GDP for security. Some of them can improve that way, and they're heading in that direction with the primary goal of meeting the 2% of GDP by the year 2024. So they still have 4 years to do that. And when this first started in 2014 with Secretary Gates saying that this should be a NATO objective, it's interesting because in every year it's improved. And most nations in Europe have come back and said, you guys in the United States have to understand, we normally plan a 5-year budget cycle. So we can't just do it next year. It's going to take us a while to get to this point. So with the president now announcing, oh, in the last year in 2019, there's been more donated to Europe since I've been in office than anybody else. That's because it's the end of that 5-year budget cycle that they promised in 2014. So it's just, you gotta, and you know this, you've got to put a little bit more brain power and analysis into what's going on. Our forces in Europe give the United States, gives the United States much more of a strategic advantage than pulling them out does. And we could go into the different dynamics of that and what they provide to the United States for our national security, but people aren't willing to listen to that. And because people don't even know what we have in Europe. We've gone from 300,000 forces during the Cold War to 90,000 during the 1990s after Desert Storm and the wall coming down, to about 30,000 US Army soldiers there that are designed to do the kinds of contingencies like what happened last week. I mean, the explosion in Lebanon, that is a contingency operation for US forces in Europe. When you don't have forces there, you can't help a nation that has some kind of a humanitarian disaster like that. I'm sorry, I tend to get emotional about this because I can't believe how dumb we are as a nation that we can't see through some of the arguments that are being presented on this particular issue.
I share your emotion, and I think it's because we're paying attention. That's kind of one of the themes of this show, right? And I wonder, people don't really consider it as a strategic lily pad, right? Like it's not just about the Germans paying it's basically like them saying, hey, you can have a part of our backyard to set up your tent, right? And that's what we've been doing for generations now. But can you talk specifically, another issue in the news, related to that region is what's happening in Belarus right now. Can you break down for folks what's happening in Belarus and why is it important to the U.S.?
Well, they have had a president there by the name of Lukashenko, who has been an authoritarian dictator for the last 26 years. Of the 49 countries that are in Europe that were part of my area of operations when I was the commander of U.S. Army forces in Europe, this was one of the 49 nations I never got to. I never traveled to Minsk. I went to all the other ones, 1 or 2 or 3 or a dozen times, been to Poland probably a dozen times, but this was one country we didn't go to because it was still using the Soviet model, even though they were no longer a Soviet satellite. And Lukashenko he's a dictatorial ruler. He was challenged by a group of progressives, one of which is Tikhonskaya. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing her name right. And the vote count that came out of the elections last week were just ludicrous. He received something like 79% of the vote in terms of the publication afterwards, whereas there were literally millions of people marching against him. So the people in Belarus knew that it was a fixed election. Election monitors were not allowed in the country. The press was not allowed in the country during the election. So it was just a sham. And now what's happening, what we're seeing, is a typical authoritarian reaction to protest of what was a fixed election. And I think it's going to be another, I wouldn't call it as much as the Arab Spring, but it certainly could cause a great deal of turbulence in Belarus and potentially backlash into Russia.
And it seems like the kind of thing, if we had a focused commander in chief, and we had a healthy functioning State Department apparatus, and coordination of all of our resources, it seems like the kind of thing we should be focused on as a nation, right? Because it can be.
Or how about even an ambassador in the country? That would be a good first start. Yeah. We don't have an ambassador in Belarus. Hell, we now don't even have an ambassador in Germany. And I could name the other countries in Europe where the charge is in charge. And most of the other ones, I mean, that's the communication piece and the information piece of national security policy and the diplomacy piece mixed in, and it's not happening. So yeah, you're talking about the focus of President Trump. I'm not sure there is a focus anywhere specifically other than on the elections.
I think that's right. And I want to come back to your thoughts on the election in a minute, but sticking with expanding this discussion, talking about Russia in particular, in my view, there's been this mantra that they meddled with our elections. In my view, they attacked our elections. I would argue it's potentially an act of war. Like, this is a very dynamic situation that hasn't ended, it's expanded. Belarus is another symptom of that, our withdrawal of German forces in Germany. And now we've got another election coming that the Russians would love to see rip us apart. But can you give us your most updated assessment of the threat from Russia, and how you think the incoming commander-in-chief, or if Trump is reelected, how they should respond to Russia?
Yeah, well, what I'd say is I certainly am not privy to any classified documents today. The last one I read was in 2013. And at the time, we were seeing from about 2006 until about 2012, when I left, or 13, there was an increasing dynamic by Mr. Putin to influence not only the democratic institutions in various countries, but also put a wedge between the United States and all of our NATO partners. And whether he did that directly against us or individual partners writ large, he was going to do it. We have seen that happen in places like Moldova, Montenegro, Estonia in 2007. And I'll use that as an example because Estonia was attacked vehemently in their 2007 elections, where a lot of their cybersecurity forces were undercut. They reacted to it. And over the last 4, 5, 6, 7 years, they have fixed it, where they are doing so many things electronically with safeguarded systems that they are now kiddingly called Estonia, as opposed to, like email or, and it's fascinating that they address the issue. We have not. And I agree with you that in 2016 and even before, we were attacked by Russia. The evidence is pretty clear on that in various national security and intelligence processes that have shown how we've been attacked. And I think it's going to be worse this time around. And yet that fire is being stoked by the current administration and being helped along, as we've seen recently, by several of our elected members of the Senate, which is just amazing to me. It is, I think, an existential threat to our institutions and our society. So we should be defending against it.
So you and I have been on the air a few times together on CNN when things were getting hairy. I think we were on air at the same time when there was the stare down with Iran, right, in the beginning of the year. And we're often called in to add perspective and analysis, but I also feel like that's missing right now in the national conversation, right? The country's talking extensively about our election, but they're not talking about whether or not that election is going to be fair, or if it's going to be protected, or if the Russians are going to be able to use it as a divisive point for us. But back here at home, can you break down from your area of expertise and your experience the national security apparatus beyond Trump. I've been very critical of Secretary of Defense Esper. I feel like consistently he sides with Trump on politics and not with our troops. But can you break down that second level and even the third levels down and the politicization of our military, where we saw, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Milley, pulled out into the streets during the protests as Trump did his Bible waving stunt. Can you break down, in your view, sir, what that all means and how potentially damaging it can be to our military, our national security, and the very fabric of our country?
Well, I think it's not just the Defense Department, though. That's the problem. There have been attacks against all of the normative institutions that are supposed to be, yes, they're political. Of course they're political. The military is political. It's different between being political versus being partisan. So yeah, the military is political, so is the State Department, so is Homeland Security. But when you're diving into institutional norms and attempting to destroy them through rumors or insults or conspiracies, like the intelligence community, like judicial system, Homeland Security, State Department, and as you just said, the Department of Defense, it causes people to be confused. And most of all, it causes people to lose trust in their leadership and in their democracy. And that's the problem I think we have right now. We have seen an erosion of trust. I would like to say to you, Paul, that I trust the government to get their act together and defend our election systems before November. But even as a military guy, I'm not sure I can say that right now. And that's damaging. And any other, you can disagree with past presidents' ideology and the way they do business. But when you start hammering on the erosion of institutions and whether or not they are actually doing their job, which has been, the reaction of this administration, that's when you have problems. And that's why you need someone to build that trust back up. And it's going to be very difficult to do that. But yeah, the other thing I'd say is we have seen, I once had a guy in a previous administration, not Obama, but before that, I won't tell you any more than that, who told me that a president usually enters office with the A team, and then by the end of the first 2 years, he's on the B team, and then by the end of the first term, if they make it to a second, they're on their C team, and then hopefully they get a rush of new people in that are better. We started out, I'm going to make an assessment, with maybe the B- team, maybe, and it's gone downhill fast. So we're in my view, we have a lot of people who don't know how to coordinate policy, who don't know how, and they don't have a strategy to live with. Hell, H.R. McMaster put out a national security strategy in 2017. You could disagree with some of the things that were said in it, but one of the things I said to H.R. at the time was, this is great, H.R., but your president isn't going to follow any of this stuff, and he hasn't. So that's the problem. There's a disconnect between, if there is a strategy, what's being executed, who's doing the execution, and the daily issues that the president brings up that causes people confusion.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think there's been a lot of analysis about Trump's decisions and Trump's personnel. But I think the basic competence, the execution of making the machines run, right? Whether that's the Department of Defense or the Treasury or the VA, that there's an influx of people who don't have the experience to understand how to get things done that keep our country running and keep our people safe. And I think that is, in my opinion, is maybe one of the most underreported things, just basic competence. In the military, you can always count on folks to be tactically and technically expert, to be able to get a job done, the job they're assigned. But there are folks now in roles that just aren't even qualified to do the job. And that, I think, has had a real erosion in the trust of our institutions. But I don't want to let you go without asking you to talk specifically about that moment in Washington.
Can I add first?
Please, go ahead.
Can I add first something to that?
Please.
As you're a leader in the military and you go from job to job and you go up the chain of command with increased responsibility, there's this feeling, and I first realized this, although I knew it before, I realized that it was so palpable when I became a division commander about to take a division to Iraq. And, I'm going to give you a dirty little secret, Paul. When I first became a division commander, I didn't really know what a division commander was supposed to do in all circumstances. So there's a requirement for a little bit of humility and depending on other people to help you out. That's also the problem with the current administration, because the people who take over aren't willing to, many of them aren't willing to listen to the experts. There's a dearth of expertise. They just walk in saying, hey, I'm now in charge and I'm going to do anything I want, even though I really don't know how this works. I'm going to try. And every administration has people who don't know what they're doing in different jobs. The key is, how do they learn and adapt very quickly from the experts that are in the organization? I just had to throw that in there.
I'm glad you did, sir. I think it's really important. And I want to ask you, related to that, to break down, in my view, one of the most damaging situations that I've seen in a presidency, where it seems like there's damaging stuff happening every day. But that moment when Trump walked out of the White House, flanked by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, flanked by the Secretary of Defense, using America's military, the National Guard, and other to clear out peaceful protesters. In my view, it was for folks that are scared of the military, right? For folks that are worried that in the worst case scenario, the military is going to be the ground force in Trump's race war or his dictatorial expansion of power, right? That was the nightmare scenario in my view, right? And in my view, the worst situation you could potentially put American troops in, right? Even more dangerous than being overseas, having them be across from their own citizens, their own brothers and sisters. It sent every spidey sense in my body up, because it didn't feel like America. But can you break down that moment in particular? And I also I'm encouraged a bit, sir, by the fact that folks did push back in behind closed doors. I think folks in the military and the retired General Corps like you and others can be a guardrail for our democracy, to say, hey, this is a line we won't cross. Some governors said they wouldn't give Trump National Guard troops. I'm sure, commanders behind closed doors in the Pentagon said no. But can you break down that moment in particular and what you saw and what you think it means?
Yeah, I don't put, truthfully, I know this is probably going to upset a lot of your listeners. I don't put as much power as many did behind that particular scene of, Milley and Esper walking out with Trump across the street to St. John's. I think they were caught up in the moment. And they're trying to support their president, which all military guys do. But neither one of them, I think, realized where they were being led at the time. Now, you can call that dumb, you can call it immature, you can call it just a real random act of idiocracy. But I think it was the momentum that carried them there. And when they got there, they realized, holy crap, this is not good. We are now being used. It was fascinating to me that both General Milley, not as much, Secretary Esper walked it back shortly thereafter. Milley did an apology to the National War College, to his peers, really. I mean, guys that were in national defense unit. That was a big deal to me. So that may have been one of those lessons learned that all generals need to learn someday in their taking on of power. That, hey, there are some things you just have to do and not do that keep you pure. But I really think the walk across the street during that I don't want, this word's going to sound too forgiving, but it was almost accidental. And they realized how bad it was probably during the walk, and then they realized how bad it appeared after the walk. So I don't think you'll catch Milley in that situation anymore, General Milley. I don't know what you'll see with Secretary Esper. He has seemed since that event to have put up more of a little bit of a wall between him and the administration when it comes to policies regarding the use of military force and others. So maybe he's learned a great deal from that, and thank God he did, truthfully, because that was a horrible scene.
Sir, you're a voice of conscience on television. You do a lot of leadership training. You're a mentor to many, and you're human like the rest of us, and you have emotions. The theme of this show is, if you're not angry, you're not paying attention. And what you choose to do with that anger is what I think determines what kind of leader and what kind of citizen you can be. But I want to ask you the question I ask of all our guests. General Mark Hertling, what makes you angry?
people showing a lack. My biggest pet peeve is a lack of integrity. When people lie or when they try and sway based on spin. And unfortunately, because that's always been my pet peeve, when people aren't transparent and address issues with candor and talk facts versus opinions. I mean, I used to get mad at my staff in combat or in USER when they would give me their opinion on things. I said, okay, that's great, your opinion. Give me some facts that back it up. Tell me what we're going to do about it. That's number one. Number two that makes me mad is whining. You know, complaining without any plan for action. And we're seeing more and more of that daily, aren't we, Paul? I mean, in terms of how many things are wrong being given to us by the present administration, but not providing any way to right it. Hell, if the electoral system is messed up and mailing ballots are a threat, which they're not, then tell me what you're going to do about it. Tell me, you're the friggin' president. You know, I expect action from you. That's a part of leadership, is to act. It isn't just to complain. I mean, I used to beat up my staff whenever they'd come in and say, hey, we've got a big problem. Oh, really? Then tell me what your solution is, and maybe we can start attacking it from that. Don't give me problems, give me potential solutions. We're not getting any potential solutions. We're just getting opinions and whining and standing up and spin and how great things are when we all know things aren't great.
I thank you for that, sir. I mean, I've talked a lot in the show and in other appearances about command climate. And we talk about that and, you know, and think about that and train about that and ponder on that when you're coming up as a leader. But can you break down in a really focused way, what's your assessment of Trump as a leader? If he was a, you know, second lieutenant under your command, you were writing his OER, right? His assessment as an officer. Can you break down not the emotional stuff that I think kind of floods through CNN and other places, but what's your assessment of his leadership?
Well, it's interesting because I teach that, Paul, you know, to doctors. Yeah. And I break it down, believe it or not. I use the Army Field Manual on leadership to show them the style of leaders. And really the Army ADRP 6-22, yes, that's a real live doctrine for those people who aren't in the Army out there listening, breaks down the leadership attributes as being character, presence, and intellect. And within each one of those attributes, in character, you have the ability to use your background, understand your own background, to do a self-assessment. You have your personal values, what you believe in, and you can state what they are. You have a vision for how you want to live your life. And you have a bit of, if you're a leader in a professional organization, you have humility and empathy as all part of your character. Those are things that are part of the character listed in our doctrinal manual. Then there's the area of presence, which says this is how you appear to people to be. Now, character, what you say you are versus how you appear, are two different things. And what leaders try and do is push those two things together. So who you appear to be is who you really are. And that's the element of leadership that's kind of important. And then the last one in intellect is, are you adaptive? Do you take advice from the experts? Do you have a sense of the world around you? Do you have an intellectual curiosity? You can give your grade to our president on each one of those things. And what I tell you is he comes up lacking in several areas in my view. So those are the attributes. The competencies are, how do you communicate to your teams? How do you build trust? And how do you steward the organization? That's under the category of lead. And then the second category under the competencies is development. How do you take your team and help them achieve the kinds of things you want them to achieve? And also, how do you self-develop to learn and grow every day? And then the third competency is, how do you act? How do you make stuff happen? What are your accomplishments? Again, if you evaluate the president on those three attributes and three competencies that I just named that come out of our field manual, you can give your own grade, which I have done. Right. Interestingly enough, Paul, what I was asked once by Anderson Cooper back in 2016 to evaluate both candidates, both Mr. Trump and Ms. Clinton, and I used those 3 and 3 to do that. Both of them, as all leaders do, fall short in some areas. But the areas where you fall short, those are the things you should try and constantly improve while using the strengths to your advantage. And, if you evaluate people against those, I think you'll see who the better leaders are. And the person of character is the one, the character of the individual drives everything else.
I think that's a fantastic and incredibly useful framework. If folks are listening and they're evaluating, being a leader for their family or for their business or looking at candidates in their area, I mean, that's a framework that can guide it. Part of why I was very excited to talk to you. So if we use that framework, lieutenant or candidate or cadet Trump is probably not being recommended for promotion. Another cadet or lieutenant that's in seek of a promotion is now Kamala Harris. So can you, similarly using that framework, what's your assessment now that she is Biden's pick for his vice presidential nominee? What's your assessment of her as a leader? And in particular, given your expertise, she's never been in the military. She hasn't served on armed services. This is something that I talk a lot about. I don't think is talked about enough. What's your assessment of her capacity? Well, first of all, her ability and experience and her capacity as commander in chief. And is she ready? If Biden's not a young guy, we have to scenario plan. We do that in the military, right? The Hal Moore scenario from We Were Soldiers Once and Young, okay, you're dead. Now you're in charge. You're dead. You're in charge. God forbid something happens and Biden is elected. She's going to be in charge. In your view, how ready is she going to be?
I don't know, but I think she has the qualities of leadership that will help her become ready. And I go back to my example of me being a division commander. Is she ready to be president tomorrow? No, I wasn't ready to be a division commander tomorrow, but I had a bunch of folks around me who would help. And I certainly didn't say when I became a division commander in combat, I know more than all the Al-Qaeda guys on all the other side, or I know more than the private down in the foxhole, or I know more than that tank commander. You've got to trust the people and surround yourself with the capable input that will help you make tough decisions. But you make those tough decisions going back to that very first attribute of character and how you see the world, what your values are. The influence of your personal background will certainly bias you one way or another, but how do you keep that under control? And, the things that hit the president's desk, I can't imagine the kinds of problems he faces. But I do know this. If it's an easy problem that can be solved by somebody else, it normally doesn't bubble up to him or her. So that person at the top really has to have a small covey or a large covey of people around them helping them out that are not self-serving, who are selfless and who are contributing to the nation, as opposed to those who are contributing to their own wealth and advancement.
So there's going to be a lot of wargaming here on who would do what in a Biden administration, right? Especially if you look at the candidates, everybody from Pete Buttigieg to Susan Rice, right? All the folks that were rumored to be finalists for VP. But now when you think about casting a potential Biden administration, something that I think needs more focus is Secretary of Defense. It's such a critical role. We see that now with Esper. We've seen it, across the board on everybody from Gates to Rumsfeld. But I think it also determines what kind of president you're going to be, who that partner is going to be. Who do you think will be the finalists in a Biden administration? We're going to hear names like Michelle Flournoy. We may hear names like Admiral McRaven, right? But who do you think will be the names we hear, whether it's those or others over the course of the next few months, who could be Secretary of Defense in a Biden administration?
Well, this is the kind of thing that the president, if it's President Biden, he has to say, who are those people, back to those leadership competencies, who are the people that I trust that have the character and the values, and also have at least a little bit of experience, hopefully a lot more than just a little bit of experience, in how the largest bureaucracy in our government is run, and an understanding of how big this behemoth of the Defense Department is and how many lives it affects and how much it affects our national security. And by the way, how do you turn it around? How do you get back to the proper approach to civil-military relations? How do you get the right people? It's not just the top job, It's how do you also get the right people in the second level and the third level and all the ASDs and DASDs and all that other stuff within the Department of Defense. The same thing is going to be true, truthfully, I think, in the State Department. The State Department, from what I can see in my assessment, and it's proven by others, has been gutted. And we will be an inflection point with diplomacy on the world stage after these 4 years. So that will be as critical. At the same time, you mentioned before the threats to our homeland. Homeland security has been somewhat dysfunctional over the last 3 years. Kelly had it under control when he was there, but it's gone downhill ever since. So all of those organizations, you're going to have to find the person with a professional approach, with an understanding that it's about our nation versus it's about themselves. Someone who doesn't have the ego, and everybody has ego, so you just have to balance that, but also someone who really understands the intricacies of what these departments do. And that's going to be really hard. But I know, I'm sure the presidential candidates on both, well, on the Democratic side is really trying hard to pick those right people right now. And I don't know who they are. I mean, there are a lot more people than I know that are out there that could do those jobs.
I think when Trump came in, he recognized the populism of the military. He's always recognized that, right? And he's manipulated it at times. But, you know, when he came in and wanted to project a sense of competence, he had his generals, right? He had McMaster's and he had the Kellys and he had, you know, Mattis and these folks that he put out in front in a casting, right? And said, these are my generals that will bring authority and competence and project strength. And I think there may be an opportunity for Biden to do something similar, but maybe a bit more nuanced, where he says, here are my, you know, my citizen soldiers, my warrior citizens, my Tammy Duckworths, my Pete Buttigieg's, my Tulsi Gabbards, right? Folks that have been on that radar, but also represent a new generation of leadership that's not just got stars on their sleeves. So the question I do want to ask you, that you're in a unique position to answer, is people have this idea of what generals are, right? And I think Trump has kind of gassed that up a little bit, this monolith, right? But can you really maybe break down what you think, what advantages, and again, they're not a monolith, they're all different, so different, but as a general yourself, what are the skills that you do uniquely bring to a political landscape, and what are the challenges that a general can bring in a political landscape?
Well, I think, and I'm going to generalize because what I'm about to say doesn't apply to all generals. Certainly, there are good and bad generals. But I think for the most part, they certainly have a training in leading organizations, large organizations. One of the reasons I was hired at this healthcare organization is because a guy at Disney told my CEO that he should hire an Army general, which surprised the heck out of this healthcare CEO. And he said, why should we do that? And he said, because they understand the scope and scale of big problems, and they know how to deal with big problems. So those two things. The third thing is that they have the ability to want to learn and grow within the organization. They reach out and find the experts to help them because they know they can't do it all in a big organizations. But there are some downsides to some generals as well. Some certainly have big egos. Some sometimes don't speak up because we are trained in the art of civil military relations, where the boss gets to make the decision and we support it after giving advice and trying to influence one way or another. But once the decision is made, we've got to do it. And sometimes that's harmful. Sometimes you got to continue to struggle in pushing back. But I also think there's a great deal of, I don't want to use the word patriotism, because that's been so bastardized over the last 3 years. But there is a desire to serve the nation, at least with most generals. So that piece of contributing to something, excuse me, bigger than yourself becomes key. But I would be hesitant, Paul, to anybody that's suggesting that if Biden is elected president, that he immediately mirrors the actions of President Trump 4 years ago, where he goes out and hires a bunch of generals. I think that would actually be very dangerous. So he should use retired generals or active generals sparingly in terms of his administration, and probably none of them in the Defense Department, if I could say that.
Mm. I think that's a really important perspective. And, you know, you've advised presidents, you've been wounded in combat yourself, right? I mean, you've had a pretty wide range of experiences, and you always maintain a sense of positivity. You inspire others. You've inspired me. You've been very generous to me and many other leaders as a mentor and as a friend. And another question I want to ask you, sir, because this is the other question all our guests get. General Mark Hertling, what makes you happy?
The biggest thing, well, that's a great question. I got to figure out how to address this. I get all choked up and emotional when I see success in people, when people achieve things. I mean, last night, I try and be nonpartisan. I try and be, you know, see both sides. But I'll be honest with you, I got emotional when Kamala Harris was named as the vice president. Yeah. Not because Biden picked a vice president, but because here's a Black woman. And it was obviously an emotional moment for the people of color in the United States and for women throughout the country who are doing so much, not just in national security, but our nation as a whole. Hell, the women that we have as doctors in our organizations are friggin' nailing it on a daily basis. They're good, and they should be given that chance. I think Kamala Harris is probably going to be, she is an excellent choice, but just the fact that she succeeded in being picked made me emotional. Graduations from high school get me all charged up because I see the potential in kids. Things that folks are allowed to do in their lives are a big deal to me. You know, you know about this, I think, Paul, but I have this box that I always carry around with me. It's both General Dempsey and General Scaparrotti and I all have it. It was something we put together in our tour together in Iraq. And it contains all the cards of soldiers that were killed under our command. Now, my box has 253 cards in it with pictures of soldiers. And I look at that box every day and I say, where would these people be today? Where would 22-year-old Rowdy Inman be if he hadn't been killed back in 2004? Would he have a family? Would he have young kids? Would he be relishing in their... So that kind of stuff makes me emotional. The top of the box says, make it matter. So folks who make it matter by advancing our population, by advancing our people, our immigrants, our young folks, our women, our people of color, that's a big deal to me. That makes me happy. That's probably a much longer answer than you wanted. Sorry about that.
Oh, that's a fantastic answer. I mean, that's one of the great reasons why I wanted to have you on this show, so you could talk about that and things like that I think are really important in a moment like this. And I want to, you know, you've been a great leader in inspiring people through hard times. For many Americans, this is one of the hardest times they've ever experienced. For our country, this is one of the hardest times we've ever experienced. You're great at motivating people and helping lead them through adversity. What's your message now as kind of a locker room coach for America and for Americans who are listening, who may be having a hard time, they're struggling, it feels like Groundhog Day, the pandemic, the protests, all of it. What's your message to them on how to help get through this tough time for us all?
We're going to get through it. That's my message. You know, the nation, if you're an amateur student of history like I am, our nation has been through this before. I mean, as a younger man, I saw the race riots and the draft riots of the late 60s and early 70s. That was a pretty tough time, and a president resigning and corruption in government and all those things. You read history. I read Chernow's grant a few months ago, and boy, during his presidency back in the 1800s, he went through some hell with Reconstruction and people asking all Black people to move back to Liberia. It was disastrous. I mean, the things he tried to quell and reverse. So we've been through this before. And what we found is every time we've been through hard times, it sharpens our character. The Black Lives Matter movement of a few weeks ago, I mean, that's really kind of snapped a lot of people to attention and helped them realize how bad things really are, that perhaps they didn't realize it before. White people, not people of color. But it's helped them realize how far apart we are. And hopefully, those kinds of things will help us pull together as a nation. We can achieve anything as a country. We really can. I mean, I've seen that happen. We just have to understand that we can, but only if we come together as opposed to being too divisive. So maybe, just maybe, hear me out on this, the last 3 years have been a good thing for us, that they have caused us to reflect on who we really are and who we really want to be as a nation. We establish our values in things like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, but we also have seen those values displayed in the Gettysburg Address and the Four Freedoms speech by Roosevelt and the first inaugural speech by Kennedy, and other things that tell us who we should be or who we aspire to. We've got to get back to understanding what those values mean and not be so self-centered. And maybe we'll do that in combining our actions to make a better nation after this.
Thank you for that, sir. And whoever is the president in January would be smart to seek your counsel and try to drag you out of Florida into Washington or wherever they can. But in the meantime,
I'm very happy not here, Paul. Thanks so much for your interest in national defense.
In the meantime, I would normally do this in person, but I want to present to you some gifts virtually. So, we'll have to have a rain check, and maybe your MG convertible and my Camaro convertible, and we can have a drag race for charity or something. But a couple things I'm going to send your way down in Florida via the post office. I'm going to start sending stuff
great
to
institution.
the United States Post Office, which needs more support right now since it's not getting it from the president. But first, I'm going to send you some Angry Americans gear made by the veterans of Oscar Mike out in Chicago. American-made stuff that's super comfortable, and I know you work out all the time. You're a great motivator in the fitness world, so maybe that'll help you. And when you come back from your run or from your working out, you can have some Bravo Sierra stuff, some hygiene
body
products.
That's what I need.
Antibacterial wipes and deodorant. Support. They donate to MWR in the military, and then for your drinking enjoyment, some Uncle Nearest 1884 American-made whiskey that we'll have over to you. It's a great story. They're a big supporter of this show. Some small batch whiskey from Uncle Nearest headed your way. And then last but not least, this is our Rorschach test of the show. That you will also get Peeps. And we have three colors, blue, yellow, and pink. And the question we ask of all our guests, General Mark Hertling, what color of Peeps would you pick and why? Blue, yellow, or pink?
Yellow, because it's a reminder of my youth. It was a Easter normality that was always in the Easter basket. It's the only kind that I like. I've never even tried the pink or the blue one, so I'm going to have to forego those.
Well, we'll send them all to you just in case. That way you can try them for the first time. But, sir, I am so grateful for your leadership. I'm so grateful for your friendship. Thank you for your example. Thank you for being a voice for this country in some really tough times. I'm honored to know you. I'm really grateful you can join us, especially right now, given all that's going on in the world. Appreciate you making the time and all you do for this country, all that you did in uniform, and even more so, all that you're doing now that you're out of uniform. It's a real inspiration. You represent the best of what this country is all about. And I'm really grateful for your leadership and your patriotism and for joining us.
Well, I appreciate all of that, Paul. That's very kind of you to say. It was a hell of a ride when I was wearing the uniform, and it's even nice now when I'm not wearing the uniform. So life is good to the Hertling clan. I appreciate it. Thanks so much.
You guys, I'll see you soon in the Hollywood Squares boxes on CNN with Cuomo or somebody else. Until then, thank you again for your leadership. Stay frosty, sir.
You got it. Thank you, buddy. Appreciate it.